Hi, this is Paul. The video I made on Thursday morning with this thumbnail about the collapse of the neo-evangelical parachurch ecosystem and the retreat from a certain type of cultural posture did surprisingly well. And as usual, these videos are sort of me trying to think through things out loud. And I never quite know where the video is going to end when I begin the video, and that is very true of this video as well. There's some other elements that have been sort of happening in a different space and a different speed. One of the things that I've noticed since I've started making videos is that videos live in an interesting relationship with print media. And that's both true of, let's say, essays, which you'll find on Substack or other platforms like First Things or Public Discourse, and books. And so one of the things that's been rolling around since the end of March is a piece called Goldilocks Protestantism by Brad East. Imagine a world without Protestantism. I don't mean a world without Christians who are neither Catholic nor Orthodox. I mean a world in which there are only two groups of Christians. The first group encompasses believers who belong to an ancient fellowship led by bishops and ordained priests who confess the creed and their sins and celebrate the Eucharist in a traditional liturgy of word and sacrament. These believers hand on tradition, petition the saints, venerate icons, and baptize their babies. Call them Catholic. Okay, so Orthodox, you get it. You get it. Call the other group evangelicals. They have no creed but the Bible. They have no bishop or priest. Instead, they have ministers and elders who are rarely ordained. They baptize not infants but adults who can make a public profession of faith. They reject the interposition of anyone or anything between the individual and Jesus, who is known immediately in the soul and clearly through the scriptures. Imagine a world in which every Christian is either Catholic or evangelical. Now, it was interesting that a while ago, Louise Perry had made a comment to this effect that she said, when I look around the UK, there's sort of only two groups that seem to be going anywhere in Christianity, and that's either the hardcore, let's call them Catholics in this sense, that's Orthodox and Catholic, and maybe some Anglo-Catholics, and the Pentecostal evangelicals. Those are the two groups that are going. And so that's very much what Brad East is seeing here. Imagine a world in which every Christian is either Catholic or evangelical with nothing in between. It is a world without Protestantism. For the religion of the magisterial reformers in the 16th century did not desire, commend, or practice either of these options. They were the via media, the middle way. They baptized babies, recited the creeds, ordained ministers in the service of the word and sacrament, practiced baptism and communion as sacraments, not as symbols, and insisted on the validity of the early councils. So that would be the Christian Reformed Church, for example. That's very much what that is. I would invite you to imagine then is one in which the middle way, neither Roman nor Anabaptist, both traditional and Reformed, has vanished. Is such a word possible? It is. In fact, we are living in it right now. Ours is a world without Protestantism. And then he goes through, of course, I'll put the link below this, but it'll go through a bunch of numbers. And, of course, for him, this is a world that he does not welcome, but says this is a serious loss, he himself being. For nearly 2 decades, Bruce McCormick, professor of systematic theology at Princeton Seminary, wrote, "The situation in which Christian theology is done in the United States today is shaped most dramatically by the slow death of Protestant churches." This is if the current rates of decline in membership continue, all that will be left by mid-century will be Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and non-denominational evangelical churches. The churches of the Reformation will have passed from the scene, and with their demise, there will be no obvious institutional bearers of the message of the Reformation. What all of this means in practice is that it will become more and more necessary for the sake of the future of Christianity to establish stronger ecumenical relations with the Catholics and the Orthodox. Now, you're a little hard-pressed. I think in some ways he oversells it, because you're a little hard-pressed to completely equate what he calls the evangelicals with the, let's say, the Anabaptists. I understand why he does it, and he has a point. But that's a very complex history, and he knows that. He knows that. That piece on First Things was followed up by a second piece, which was just recently released on Public Discourse, Low Church in High Places, The Fate and Future of American Protestantism. So he follows up, he begins with some of the similar ideas. For many of us, it means not Catholic. Okay. There was a time when the umbrella term did some work. Protestants included the heirs of Martin Luther, of John Calvin, of Thomas Cranmer, even Menno Simons. Later, there were break-offs and dissenters, including Pietists, Lutherans who cared about the heart, Puritans, Anglicans who cared about the heart, Baptists, one-time Puritans who cared about the heart, and Methodists. Are you sensing a pattern? But the family, however extended, was still recognizable. Aside from a small number of exemptions, you could generally count on Protestants to claim the full heritage of the Reformation as their own. They did so by confessing the creed, ascribing supreme authority to the Bible, ordaining their pastors to the minister of the word and sacrament, and most of the time baptizing their babies. Fractious was less about the program and more about fidelity of execution. If the Protestant Revolution was above all a revolution of the heart, then any time the emphasis shifted to the head, to codified doctrines and calcified institutions, it was only a matter of time before new reformers would arise to lay claim to the original vision and start the whole process all over again. That's a really important paragraph, and it's quite true. In fact, I think his second article is better than the first. It's sharper. Well, that's sort of the way thought progressives. You get feedback from the first article, and you write a second, and it sharpens and sharpens and sharpens. This pattern was common to all revolutions and proved reliably cyclical for successive generations of Protestant believers. What about a more radical vision, though? One that went down to the roots. Europe already contained the seeds of such thoroughgoing transformation, but it wasn't until the American frontier that they bore lasting fruit. This fruit is, you might say, a third species of the genus Western Christianity. Neither Catholic nor Protestant, it was taken more than 2 centuries to come into clear view. It goes by many names, but the best is also the most wholly contested evangelical. Now, in the last video, I was careful in the title to use neo-evangelical, which, again, if you listen to Tim Keller's comment, was not the preferred term by Carl Henry, but Ockenga sort of used it because he needed a term. And Molly Worthen uses it with more precision with her book, The Apostles of Reason. So there's a lot that you can say about this. As I use it, evangelical names non-Catholic Christians who are low church. By this I mean that evangelicals are biblicist, meaning the Bible isn't just a chief among many authorities, including church tradition, but the one and only authority. Autonomous, meaning their organizational leadership structures are neither local or, if translocal, then voluntarily and quite loose. Egalitarian, meaning they either do not ordain pastors, or if they do, then qualifications for and prerogatives of the clergy of the ministry are modest. Entrepreneurial, meaning churches are often analogous to startup business ventures, founded and led by charismatic individuals who cast a vision for the community. Evangelistic, meaning proselytization is high on the agenda, using money, grassroots training, and parachurch ministries to support foreign missions and local efforts at gaining new converts. Affective, meaning their piety is focused on the heart, which is more likely to find expression in music, song, and spontaneous spiritual gifts than as robes, rituals, and sacraments. On last week's live stream, Friday live stream, Mark Parker went on a rant, and I think that's interesting at this point in that paper.
One of the things I thought about when you were talking about the church in China, Caleb, and then Paul, you brought up that the oppression is internal, not external, within the culture, and that was the state of Christianity better part of its first 300 years was it was alienated from the levers of power within the empire by a great empire. And when it was liberated, ultimately it exploded from with it's all this energy had built up and thought and organization, and really it didn't stop Christianity from just deepening. It just then bloomed. It took over the empire very quickly once Constantine took the lid off. But what I would fear for Chinese Christianity, I'm very interested in what Chinese Christianity and what Indian Christianity and what African Christianity is going to bring to us, because we need to be saved. I think Western Christianity is a catastrophe. I would say American, and this is after doing a deep study. I'm neck deep in a study of the history of evangelicalism in America, and it is an all-out. I called my own church a shit show. It is the grander shit show, presiding over all the little shit shows spread across this continent. And I mean this very specifically, and in a way that the Chinese Christianity, Eastern Christianity, could actually fix us. That is not Eastern Orthodox, but a new Eastern Christianity out of the cultures of India and China, is that evangelicalism in America after the American Revolution began as an individualistic reaction to authority. The Second Great Awakening, Arminianism against Calvinism, boom, sweeps across. Then we get, and with each subsequent awakening, Second Great Awakening, Azusa Street in 1906, Jesus People, it's individualism doubling down again and again and again. More individual, more internal, more about me, more performative. Right. And then we have just recently the Asbury revival, which took place just an hour's drive from Cane Ridge in Kentucky.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yes, that's close. Named after Francis, the university is named after Francis Asbury, the man who basically stayed during the Revolution and solidified Methodism in America. They say he's more responsible than Wesley for making Methodism great in America.
Really?
Yes, and by the early 19th century, it was the largest Protestant denomination within the United States. It was powerful, but it shaped everything that came after it.
Yeah.
And that revival culture, what you have then in Asbury, it's so individualistic.
Yeah.
Go to the testimonies online. It's bone chilling when you stop to think about it, because they have all this mystical, wonderful music behind it, and in the background, all these interviews. And we're all supposed to be heartwarmed by these young people who have these deeply internal, deeply individualistic experiences. And they're very proud, very, very proud of the fact that there's no preachers. This is unorchestrated. This is unplanned. As soon as somebody older stands up to preach, the Spirit left the room. But when a young person, a Zoomer, it's like a cultural revolution within evangelicalism in this moment for 2 weeks.
Oh, it's like the Jesus people. I mean, that was the same thing with the Jesus people.
Same thing, only more so. There's not even a Lonnie Frisbee at Asbury, right? There's no standout personality, theology, teaching whatsoever. It is all we got internal healing. We're deeply wounded. They're deeply traumatized by COVID, the lockdowns, the disruption to their lives, the grooming that's been going on with the algorithms through social media that's been taking place on their consciousness. This is just like what all the other revivals, a traumatized population suddenly finding healing in this revival experience, but it's more individualistic than ever. And what I was hoping for a Chinese Pope. And
you got an American one.
But we got an American. I'm the only American who's disappointed we got an American Pope. I really hope that something very new and different will come along and break us out of this 200-year dream of I'm one person by myself in the world.
All right. All right. Wow. It was interesting because today Alex Luna's pitch in the Friday Estuary live stream was basically the problem of people. That people, on one hand, hell is other people, and on the other hand, I can't stand to be alone. And so when Mark hits these individualism themes, it's really interesting because, that's deep in what Brad East would call evangelicalism. Note well that these 6 features all center on the individual will, which in turn helps to explain why evangelicals do not baptize their babies. Faith cannot be imposed, it can only be chosen. And to go back to one of Rod Hare's ongoing anxieties about the fact that when everything is required to be voluntary, well, that's going to shape everything. Because most of us grew up in this world because a great number of things were involuntary. You have to go to bed. You have to eat your vegetables. You have to go to church. You have to get an education. You have to get married. You have to. And increasingly, we've come into a culture where individualistically, no one can tell me what to do. No one should tell me what to do, and if you try to tell me what to do, I will react badly to you to such a degree to get you to stop, because it's simply easier to walk away from me than to actually have you continue to engage with me as I push back on any kind of imposition into my will. That has set up this reaction going the opposite way. That's right. And I mean, Ron and I lived through, and as did Mark, anybody our age, we lived through the abandoning in the Christian Reformed Church. The tradition of the Christian Reformed Church was intentionally dismantled. It really was. We had the worship wars. I mean, Ron and I both grew up heavy Sabbatarian influences. That was decried as legalism, should be abandoned. You can go, I think, is Russ's still closed on Sundays, Ron?
I'm not sure.
Because he's not looking for a place to eat on Sundays. And,
how revolutionary would it be, guys, if Christians stopped going to restaurants after church on Sunday? What statement would that make? Both positive and shocking, because it would be a negative. I mean, the restaurant industry would be up in arms, but I mean, I'm starting to wonder if we should go back to that.
Well, I was just watching a video on, Japanese depopulation. And so one of the women who's a leader in that movement, she's recommending Japanese people leave the cities. Japan is urbanized at like a 90% rate. People leave the cities, go back to the village. And I thought, if America really wanted to, because they're just talking about the tyranny of the job, what if we went back to blue laws, which I grew up with in New Jersey? Blue laws were basically stores, restaurants, anything that's non-essential, close it on Sunday. Bring back the Protestant Sabbath. And I mean, the culture would change.
Well, we'd have to voluntarily do it first before we impose it on the wider culture, because Americans are allergic to being told what to do.
Right.
Yeah, unless there's a majority of the people that want that. They want the minority of the population to be told what to do. That's also true in America. But so anyway, we've got Corner Citizen. What say you, Alan?
Hey everybody, good to be back. Yeah, this is a mixture of this conversation and something Paul said earlier. I got my axe to grind with Paul out of love. Paul was
grinding in love.
Yeah, with love. As iron sharpens iron. Someone wrote that down one time. The first point is with enforcement of rules within church, and how Paul's pointed out very rightly that you basically can't do that, because if you were ever gonna if anyone was going to ever enforce a rule, they would just leave. I would say at my church, which was very small at the time, probably 40, 50 people regularly attending, there was church discipline for someone. And when he was told he would be brought in front of the whole congregation and disciplined and, told what he did, he left, right? And exactly what you said. But you know what all the women said is, oh, well, I'm really glad our pastor did that because it made us feel safe. And so this idea of like, well, we can't easily enforce the standards, so there are no standards. It really has this immense downstream consequence. And I think in a lot of these conversations, we don't look at the upstream causes of what's happening downstream. Like even in this conversation, it's like not eating after church. It's like, well, who's going to cook? It's like, well, everyone works a job. Everyone works a 9 to 5. Everyone commutes in and out. Your whole day, 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. is accounted for. Like there is no big dining room. You don't use it. You're lucky to eat around a small table. So who's going to feed the 10 people that come to your house? So it's like, I'm not saying we can account for everything and like maybe people can figure out ways, but that church discipline one of like, we need to actually create structures and there are going to be consequences for not enforcing these things. It's like, yeah, no one takes the pastor seriously because he never enforces anything. It's like everybody respected our pastor for being like, okay, he stood up and he showed us what it looks like. He was fair. He said he was just going to stand him up in front of everyone in the congregation, say what he did, make it communally known. It had been reported 1-on-1, then 2-on-1, then to the congregation. This is how the standards are enforced. And then everyone's like, okay, you got to fly right. You can't just, be drunk at an event. You can't just harass girls, whatever it is, whatever it is. And at the same time, we also had a mega church that collapsed while I was here in New York City. And a lot of those people said, oh, we never felt safe at that church. We loved the worship, but we never felt safe. It's like, well, so it's like, it doesn't boggle my mind of like why there are no pillars because no one's in, there's no foundation. No one's actually like, so I think there was a lot of benefit in my mind.
So it was interesting because, again, there was a generational division there in terms of discipline. Now, what would be interesting is if a woman was being disciplined for something, because in my experience, those go different ways. Now, if a man is being disciplined for, let's say, a sexual behavior that's felt to be predatory, that's a pretty easy thing to discipline somebody over. But let's say if a woman was being disciplined for, that's, in my experience, that gets trickier, especially if the male pastor is disciplining a woman for X. And in almost every case of even situations that get close to discipline, and if there's a factioning up in the church, it gets really complex quickly. So part of what's happening right now is we are having a bigger conversation with respect to what level of demand and coercion do we want and for what? It's not hard to grasp that what respectable Protestants in the early 19th century thought of evangelicals when they first started to make noise. At best, ignorant déclassés upstarts. At worst, heretics, nincompoops, and frauds. Despoilers of doctrine, corrupters of tradition, arrogant racketeers of religion, pulling the wool over simpletons' eyes. Would be better or worse if they actually believed what they were hawking. No creed, no clergy, no church. Now, one of the interesting things is that Mark, who was speaking in that one clip, he has been part of a Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ church that comes out of the Stone Campbell movement, which, because of what they've been talking about on the House of Woo, we've been looking at the Stone Campbell movement. And it's very interesting. It's following the Second Great Awakening. It's just before Charles Finney. Very interesting how these issues have been roiling in American society and sort of making their way slowly. And he mentions his Goldilocks Protestantism piece. He mentions the drop. Let's date the pinnacle. Let's say 1950s. This is the peak of the main line. By one estimate, in 1958, more than half of all Americans belonged to a mainline Protestant denomination. You get that number? Think about that in today's world. Can you imagine if more than half of Americans went to it's just inconceivable today. 1958, more than half of Americans went to a mainline Protestant denomination. Think Methodist, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Episcopalian. It's a mistake to wonder how many of these were actual as opposed to nominal Christians. The social prestige was the point. A prestigious institution is powerful just to the extent that it attracts members regardless of their beliefs. The main line was what you belonged to if you aspired to join. And people would sometimes try to climb up the mainline ladder because the Methodists were on top, followed by the Presbyterians, and then Lutherans, and then Methodists were sort of at the bottom. And then below that, of course, were the Baptists and the other fundamentalist denominations. So you aspired to belong to one, sought the respect of, wanted to remain in. The class that ran the country, these are the WASPs. Presidents, politicians, businessmen placed formal membership in a known and vetted Protestant denomination. If you weren't in that church, let's say in a town, if you didn't go to the right church, you wouldn't know the right people, you wouldn't get the right business deals. There were neither irreligious nor part of the riffraff, fundamentalists, Pentecostals, Mormons. Like Roman philosophers, their private skepticism and unchristian habits were beside the point. Civil religion binds society together. Pay your tithes, say your prayers, make the sacrifices, otherwise the center might not hold. Now, it's important to recognize the upsides and downsides of that kind of society. Again, America didn't have a state church. And what I mean by a state church is one institution. There wasn't a metropolitan or a pope or an archbishop or that was over the country. There were implicit institutions, but everybody understood the hierarchy and there were consequences. This was, again, back to, this was a lion country where they weren't afraid to enforce their ideas of hierarchy and morality. Something that I wrote on the Twitter post that I did. I think Brad Eastpeace misses the question of how traditions align with political power. The Roman Catholics, the Orthos, and the Magisterials all have one thing in common. They were state churches. They were designed to, in some ways, reign over territory. This highlights the parish model as opposed to the American voluntary association model. In some ways, the parachurch, non-denominationals, are heirs of something of the radical Reformation. Their kingdom is not of this world, not just from this world. In the U.S., our state church wasn't institutional like the Roman Catholic, the Ortho, or the European state churches. That's why the parachurches played such an influential role, and not just the evangelical kind. It was the Rotary, it was the Lions Club, it was the lodges, it was the country clubs. It's important to recognize that a big part of the downfall of the mainline was the fall of WASP elites. It was the inclusion of Catholics and Jews and African Americans that was necessary and godly that destroyed something of what they had. The racial and racist apostolic succession, in quotes, also was the carrier of their traditions. Their lion culture, they sought to civilize their own. And that's where I bring up this Eric Torenberg Substack, where he talked about the old elites and the new elites, soft bigotry of low expectations. In 1960s, 95% of working class children were born to two-parent households. In 2005, that dropped to 30%. Meanwhile, 85% of wealthy children were born to two-parent households. George Bush called it the soft bigotry of low expectations. Bush is interesting because his father was a patrician, an Episcopalian. George W. Bush was the one who had a conversion experience saved from a profligacy of baseball and alcohol by a walk on the beach with none other than the saintly Billy Graham. And so it was George W. Bush that his presidency was, in a sense, ensured by his evangelical bona fides, even though afterwards there's some ways in which George W. Bush sort of showed himself as a patrician later on. This is not a new thing. I was just listening to The Barbarian Heirs to Rome, Warlords of the West, the beginning of that short series by The Rest is History.
He's a man of pretty humble lineage, certainly not high class in any way. And he is called Martinus, or as we would call him today, Martin. And he is stationed one winter in Amiens, which is very much in the region where the Franks are being stationed as well. So kind of what's now northeastern France.
Yeah.
And
I'm just reading here. Shall I read what happened to him, Tom? Would you enjoy that?
I would, because I actually wrote it. It's in Dominion.
Oh, right. I'm reading that. So I'll read it with the respect it deserves. The cold that year was exceptionally bitter. A beggar in rags stood shivering by the gateway of the city. His fellow townsmen, wrapped up warm as they crunched through the snow, gave him nothing. Then came Martin. Dressed for duty, he had no money, only his arms. As a soldier, though, he did have his heavy military cloak, and so taking out his sword, he cut it in two and gave half to the beggar. Oh, that's kind. The following night, Martin had a dream. He saw Christ dressed in the very portion of the cloak that he'd given away that day. And the Lord said to him, as he had done on earth, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." Oh, that's such a moving story. And I bet that really happened.
So a very dramatic moment, Christ appearing to this soldier Martin, who's given away half of his cloak. And Martin is convinced by this appearance of Christ to essentially to give up on his military career. So he's offered a donative by Julian along with all his other men. And he refuses to accept it, and he demands to be released from the army. And it supposedly tells Julian, "Until now it is you I have served. From this moment on, I am a servant of Christ."
But Julian didn't like that.
That was a shocking display of lèse majesté.
Yeah.
The truth is, Dominic, that it is Martin and not Julian who embodies the future, because Julian is better known as Julian the Apostate, the last emperor to worship the traditional Roman gods. And Martin, of course, is a Christian, and the future of the Roman Empire is a Christian one.
Oh, the irony.
But the thing about Martin is that he is a Christian of a peculiarly radical kind.
Your favorite kind.
Because even though Julian is very hostile to Christianity, Constantius, his cousin, he's a Christian. Most of the Roman elites are starting to kind of jump ship and become Christian. They can tell the way that the wind is blowing. And when they become Christian, they don't give up their wealth or their snobbery or their kind of contempt for the poor. Instead, they see the church as another opportunity for self-advancement. So whereas a previous generation of the elite might have become, consuls or whatever, now they might become bishops, because to be a bishop is to be, in the late Roman Empire, the Christianizing Roman Empire, is to be a figure of immense authority and power. And they retain all the appurtenances of power. They keep their palaces, they keep their slaves, they keep their fine clothes. But Martin that's not what he's into at all. He completely rejects this kind of conviction that you can be Christian and be rich. So an admirer of his, who is himself an aristocrat, who is converted to Martin's understanding of Christianity, writes of Martin, "His looks were those of a peasant, his clothes shoddy, his hair a disgrace." And Martin's ambition is to become what the Greeks call a monarchus, so literally one who lives alone, i.e. a monk. And he's one of the first monks in the Western half of the empire, because they kind of originate in the eastern half. And he settles on a grassy plain named Marmoutier, which is 3 miles downriver from the Gallic town of Tours. And he subjects himself to incredible austerity. So as a soldier, of course, he'd gone through vigorous military training, but now as a monk, he's basically living on nothing. He's enduring extremes of cold and heat, living a very, very tough life. But this becomes a source of huge admiration for lots of people in Gaul. So there are people in the elites who come to admire him, not despite, but because of his rejection of everything that they represent, all the kind of, the worldly standards of greatness. And it wins him the ability to perform spectacular miracles that further kind of increases his fame. And so you start to get people of immensely wealthy backgrounds giving up the kind of traditional path to greatness and to rank and coming to join him, and they camp out in caves or in wooden shacks.
Just a question about the miracles. What's he doing? What are the miracles? Just give us a sense of the...
He's healing the sick, people with twisted limbs. He's straightening them. He's giving sight to the blind. He's giving voice to the mute. All of this is absolutely, it's
amazing,
absolutely happening. And the proof of this, Dominic, and I can see you looking skeptical,
in
371, Martin is elected as the Bishop of Tours. And this is absolutely stupefying because, as we've been saying, bishops are people from the absolute elite of society. And it comes as a complete shock to the elites, but it also comes as a shock to Martin, who doesn't want to be a bishop at all. And he runs away and hides himself in a barn. And the geese go and tell the people who've elected him where he is. And so he has to come out and become a bishop.
How did they... Quick, just a small thing, but how did the geese communicate to those people?
They honking.
Okay, they just honk and people interpret it as they...
They honk and hiss.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not talking. That would be...
It's like Lassie communicates to everyone. Timmy fell down the well. Woof, 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 woof. Everybody gets it. You can honk and hiss and say, Martin is over here. Grab him so you can make him a bishop.
Too miraculous.
Okay.
So anyway, but the miracles continue. And this means that Martin, he has a source of power that does not derive from the traditional standards of Roman life. It's coming directly from heaven. And so that means that his person is charged with an incredible source of power. And it means that when he dies, in Christian opinion, his body, his relics, will continue to be a source of power. And so he dies in his cell, and two groups of people, one from Tours and one from the neighboring city of Poitiers, they both decide that they would like to have the body. And so they all camp outside his cell. And the people of Poitiers basically block off the entrance so that the people of Tours can't get in and stand guard over it. But they then all fall asleep. And the people of Tours who've stayed awake, they sneak in through the window, grab the body, take it to Tours in great triumph, and they keep it there. And so from that point on,
he becomes...
the relics of Martin are kept.
Isn't it a funny thought that if only that little confrontation worked out differently, the French might not have shamed themselves in 1356, the Battle of Poitiers, because he would have been on their side.
It's another example from French history of people falling asleep at inopportune times.
It is.
There you go, Frenchmen. Don't fall asleep. What's nice about this is that Tom talks about the fact that, okay, so the Roman Empire is receding. In many ways, the structure of the church is replacing it. The structure of the church just grows into the recession of the Roman Empire. That is why, in many respects, the Bishop of Rome today retains imperial language, customs. He is the Pontiff. He is the bridge. The Bishop of Rome is the Pontiff. And so there's all of this going on, but then, of course, in Christianity, you have this twisting where it's not straightforward karmic revelation where the wealthy and the powerful, by virtue of their wealth and power, they are shown as being blessed by God, that their power and their wealth is a sign of God's favor. No. So Martin, again, classic Christian, reverses it, and his austerity, his renunciations, all of this, again, you can read They Flew, all of this then become an alternative source of power. And this is going to set up the long history in Europe of the emperor and the pope and how those go back and forth. Now, again, in America, a lot of that is by this time sort of digested into the system. And clergy have no political role as such in America. They have a separate role. So Billy Graham is the spiritual advisor to presidents, all the way up to Bill Clinton. And, Billy Graham would get burned in that way many times. For example, Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton. But of course, even when George W. Bush goes into the presidency, his relationship with Billy Graham is used as a political note. critical for understanding the loss of the main line. This article that I've pointed at for years, how the civil rights movement converted liberal white Protestants to secularism. Figuring out what awakenings have been in American culture. Mark was doing, you have the first and the second great awakenings. That's pretty set. Many people will look at the Jesus people movement as sort of an awakening. Others point to the civil rights movement as an awakening. It is a different kind of awakening, though, in that in some ways the civil rights movement was a secularizing awakening. It is true that churches like the one I grew up in, like the one that I serve today, churches embraced integration as a value in and of itself in the 60s and 70s. But part of this leads to what Brad East describes happens in the main line. The center did not hold together. Today, perhaps fewer than 1 in 10 Americans is a mainline Protestant, and most of them don't go to church. Demographers predict that in the next dozen years, the percentage will tend downward until it settles around 1 to 3%. So what happened? At this point, the story is well told. The best books on the subject are Ross Douthat's Bad Religions, Joseph Bottom's An Anxious Age, and Tara Isabel Burton's Strange Rights. Let me go down a little bit more. Talks a little bit about the black church, Protestantism, and the sexual revolution. The transition from Eisenhower to Kennedy symbolizes for the American mainline both a summit and a cliff. I think Charles Colson's book Born Again is critical reading in this transition because, of course, Jimmy Carter gets elected president, and Time magazine shows him to be the first born-again president of the United States. You can already see sort of the counterculture coming in and how the counterculture in the church is affected by the counterculture. What happens is that the civil rights movement and then the counterculture sort of form a 1-2 punch, and they take out that old WASP aristocracy and the traditions and the apostolic succession to a great degree. I mean, David Brooks continues, and Scott Galloway as well, continue to point to it and say, that really hasn't completely gone away. They sort of include like oligarchs from the third world. If you go to an Ivy League, commencement, you will see the children of oil money in Nigeria and industrial oligarchs in China, because they're getting in, they're Asian and African, so it's inclusion, but they're not inner city descendants of slaves. And even if you look at, Glenn Lowry was pointing to Barack Obama, not a descendant of American slavery. Colin Powell, not a descendant of American slavery. Even African Americans that have risen to the pinnacle of power in the United States, in some ways sort of being lifted by affirmative action and many of these programs that come through America and sort of destroy the old elite structures, but they're not the descendants of the slaves. They're immigrants, but they sort of can ride on those programs that were made for the descendants of slaves. The reason is that the 1960s kicked off two epochal trends that continue to the present. The first was the sexual revolution. It could be argued that in the last 75 years, every major public debate in the American church, including every occasion for schism and division, has been about sex. It was interesting that Caitlin Beatty noted that all of these cue things about sex, and it's like, yeah, duh. Brad East makes the point there. All of the schisms, all of the takedown. Look at how many CCM artists deconstructed, and what's the number one reason they give? Why aren't gays accepted in your evangelical church? That's why all those Q conferences are about sex. Divorce and remarriage, artificial conception, birth out of wedlock, working mothers, single parenting, the pill, abortion, ordination of women, sex outside of marriage, same-sex marriage, gender identity, and biological sex. These and not arguments about Jesus or justification by faith have dominated American discourse. Race, again, is the only other contender, whether in the 70s or 2020s. This, too, is a social and not a doctrinal issue. With respect to sex, the mainline bet on the wrong horse. It allied itself to the liberalism of the political, educational, and cultural elites, and this, it turned out, was not what most American Christians were looking for. Even when they agreed on the politics, mainline Protestants had always been respectable, and since political and sexual liberalism was supposed to be not just the spirit of the present age, but the vanguard of the future. And again, when you've got Ryan Bell, Seventh-day Adventist pastor, who tries his year away from God, he comes out of this basically saying, you know, I thought the church was supposed to be the vanguard. It isn't. The university activists are the vanguard. The university professors are the vanguard. The church is this piano without wheels that the culture is trying to drag forward. And so, you know, whenever the wrong parent gets elected, it's all fingers pointed at the evangelicals. Then liberalism as such needed to be embraced and proclaimed from within the church, from her pulpits and prayers and pamphlets. This liberalism was all-encompassing. It was moral, it was political, it was activistic, and ultimately it was theological too. It called into question the trustworthiness of Scripture, the classical metaphysics of the creeds, the traditional morality of the catechisms, and much more besides. Defection and loss weren't instantaneous, but once the ball got rolling, it only sped up as the years went by. Two phenomena are noteworthy. On one hand, ordinary people in the pews needed a reason to come to church. But if the main line was merely the Democratic National Party at prayer while crossing its fingers even during the prayer, then why go? Why not sleep in, drift away, or maybe join the young, vibrant, energetic startup around the corner? Sure, they might be a little conservative, but they're onto something. There's life there. And there's no doubt that they believe. Evangelicals aren't known for crossing fingers. Again, that's sort of that fundamentalist impulse that I talked about in the previous video, where a fundamentalist will say, I don't care what you think of me. This is what I believe. Live with it. Whereas an evangelical will say, well, yeah, they'll be winsome like me. So those are those two spirits. On the other hand, mainline leaders living in the post-war boom failed to realize how much they depend on the social and religious capital built up from prior centuries. It was interesting when Skye Jitani was talking about where he gets pushback from when he looks at his Holy Post Plus, he says, they're all to the left of me. That's like, yeah, they're older, they like their church, they've been habituated to it, and they see their churches going the other way. That's been what's happened in the Christian Reformed Church. And then, of course, that group has been now being pushed out of the Christian Reformed Church. Sort of the reverse of what happened in the mainline churches with the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and the Lutherans, where all of those churches leaked left and split right, where the Christian Reformed Church has been splitting left and, well, leaking right to the evangelicals. Yeah, a lot of that in the last 30 years. They fervently believe about the separation of church and state, but they operated as the clerisy of an unofficial established church. Bang, there it is. They cared about helping the poor, but their education and values, not to mention the sources of their prestige and good portion of their roles, were substantially upper class. They hated war and segregation, but their WASP credentials alienated them from the working class, both white and black. And their fence-sitting on Vietnam marked them as insufficiently radical for the left and insufficiently patriotic for the right. While their young members protested, their older members began to trickle out the door. In a word, mainline leadership took for granted, one of the most surprising pushbacks I've ever gotten on this channel was when I pointed out that, oh shoot, who's that? Rick Steves' girlfriend was she an Episcopal cleric? I mean, I made a comment about, do you think they sleep together? They've been boyfriend and girlfriend for a long time. In my experience, when you have boyfriend and girlfriend for a long time, with evangelicals, and especially with fundamentalists, because I've seen this at the local level, they'll make a point, we are not having sex. The main line, oh, come on, come on. I remember when I made that point, wow, did I get kicked back. I thought, this is fascinating, because then I said, now let's reverse this the other way. Let's say that the pastor of your church is a male and he's single. Let's say he's a divorced male in his 50s and he's sleeping and dating women in the congregation, in or not in the congregation, in their 20s or 30s. You know, the fall of Cuomo from the governorship of New York was very interesting. You can have a female minister who's sleeping with her boyfriend. Everybody will say, well, that's okay. But if you have a male minister who's sleeping with different women, can't do that. In a word, the mainline leadership took for granted that the world they had always known and led would somehow remain in place even as they helped to birth a new world to replace it. Wow, that is a great line, and that's usually what elite leaders do. I was listening to The Rest is History on, it was both the coronation of Charlemagne and the fall of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev thought things would remain in place while I change it and reform it. Nope, they don't. It's all part of a system. But in midwifing the new secular order into being, they rendered themselves redundant. Once you've placed a question mark next to traditional beliefs, traditional morals, and traditional texts, what else is left? Absent these, there's no reason to join a religious tradition except for community and social capital. But those are byproducts of membership. As the sole motivation for observance and attendance, they are far too weak to sustain belonging, especially when peer pressure was relaxed. It is a tautology to say that religion became optional when it's no longer compulsory. There's Rod Hare's point. Compulsoriness, however, is said in many ways. For many people, church was felt to be compulsory, even if strictly speaking it was not. And once the feeling was gone for mainline Protestants, they started heading for the exits. Actually, they didn't head for the exits. They just stopped coming in through the entrance. So then he writes about the American trend of leaving church. I don't have... Who will replace the main line? That is the question. And Catholics have been vying. You know, it was very interesting when you hear Caitlin Beatty talk about, I played it in the previous video. When you hear Caitlin Beatty talk about, I couldn't believe it when she uses Francis Collins as an example. But basically, the evangelical assumption of how, well, these will be, it was basically the mainline assumption. But then when you get to the top of power, what do you do? So I asked on Twitter because, I'd heard everybody just bad-mouthing Francis Collins, and I didn't know why. I so often on the internet feel like such an innocent. So then I asked people on Twitter, why all the hate for Francis Collins? Yeah, I heard. You know, part of it was his performance during COVID, but it wasn't just he was on the wrong side of things. It was how he engaged his adversaries. And then it was all that the NHH was doing. Plenty of people I know on Twitter had a lot to say. It was very interesting. New HHS documents reveal millions of federal funding for University of Pittsburgh human fetal organ harvesting project, including viable and full-term babies. So, is this what happens, evangelicals, when your elites rise to the top? Was this the plan? And, you know, with the Catholics, it's of course been interesting because on one hand, you've got Biden and Pelosi and JFK. On the other hand, you have these Catholic Supreme Court justices And the assumption is that when these Catholic Supreme Court justices will get to the top, they'll deliver. They won't waffle. Now, of course, people have their different opinions if they're delivering and they're waffling. But in the case of Francis Collins, he's a convert. He gets to the top, and what does he do? He doesn't deliver. I said I'd lift up 4 themes, and so far I've mentioned 2, the sexual revolution and secularization. The other 2 are simply other Christian traditions, evangelicalism and Catholicism. These, in a sort of pincer movement, quietly advanced on the main line's position, and when the opportune moment arrived, attacked it from both sides. It didn't happen all at once, rather it resulted from decades of quiet incremental expansion. I don't know if they attacked it. You can make an argument that evangelicals have been attacking the main line. Well, the Catholics have done their share of attacking. But I don't think they've gotten, number one, they haven't replaced it. I think the Catholics have been more successful. Aaron Renn has been making this point for a long time, that Aaron Renn would like to see the evangelicals step in to replace the main line, but Aaron Renn's got a whole bunch of reasons why they won't and likely can't do it. We have already seen what has long attracted so many Americans to evangelicalism: the frontier spirit, the can-do attitude, the charismatic vision, the muscular ambition, the cultural adaptability, the missionary zeal, the effective dimension, the leveling spirit, youth, vitality, growth, expansion. These have always marked American evangelicalism, even and especially when besieged by challenges. Listen to what Mark said in the clip that I played earlier. Whether from now or from within, whether from without or from within, you can see this today in the only growing Christian group in America, the so-called non-denominational churches. It is unclear whether this group comes from converts to faith or transfers, both. At any rate, it is one example of the older frontier flexibility adapted to the new competitive marketplace, innovating to attract newcomers inside the church. And he's right. It's not that the Catholics haven't picked up on this too, though. And so what I think we're going to see is that Tim Keller said, I think correctly, that the non-denominationals are the heirs of the parachurches. Basically, what happened, I think, during the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, is that parachurch practices, campus ministry, youth ministry, you had a generation formed by those practices, and then they'd go and find the mainline church, the fundamentalist church, Protestant churches, as he calls them, and says, what we did in college really worked. What do you mean by worked? We grew numerically. We had enthusiastic converts. We got people's attention, and now once the people had money, you'll get their money too. So we should basically keep doing what we should take what we learned in the parachurch and now do it within the church. And the thing about doing it within a church, especially a church plant, especially a non-denominational church, is that there are no rules. You can do what's practical, what works. Another qualm I have with this piece is you're seeing the Americanization of Catholicism. That's been happening for a long time. And I think some of the dynamics in the parachurch are also going to happen in the Catholic Church. The boundaries between the churches are extremely porous and quite low. And I know that the Orthodox are coming in sort of as the brawny, missionary, monastic. A lot of American influence in there. It's just going to happen. And that's not a bad thing. Well, it might be looked on as a bad thing for a lot of Orthodox. But this is sort of the genius of America, is its adaptability. But of course, adaptability is a double-edged sword. Adapt too much, you lose the thread. But, of course, that American adaptability has been sort of the seed that has gone out into the rest of the world in terms of how many evangelical and startup churches. This is a point that my friend Eric Dirksen made in Voices. He says, in that list of churches, you don't see the Christian Reformed Church. In a way, you might reduce the complexity of that religious future, which I risk repeating is the present, by reference to 4 groups: Catholics, evangelicals, cultural Protestants, and other. Other would encompass actual mainline Protestants, Eastern Orthodox Christian, and all non-Christian religious traditions, as well as vehemently anti-Christian groups. Cultural Protestants would describe Christian-friendly atheists and agnostics, adherents of American civil religion, citizens who don't go to church but pray in the name of Jesus, and ex-Christians of various stripes. In other words, all people who wear the mantle of high Protestant civilization and its mores, which is to say the worldview minus the metaphysics. And this returns us to where we began, namely the vast middle of American Christianity, utterly hollowed out mainline believers who remained in the faith even when hovered up into Catholic traditions or pulled down into evangelical fellowships. And he names PCA, Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, newcomer, the Global Methodist Church, offshoots of Episcopalians like the Reformed Episcopal Church, REC, Anglican Church of North America, ACNA, Anglican Mission in the Americas, AMIA. And again, what was his name? Weber? I got his books on my shelf behind me. Part of what's been happening is in evangelicals, we've seen this re-sacramentalizing. You've got the Renovare movement, you've got Dallas Willard, you've got Richard Foster. These have tended to be low church people who are bringing higher church spiritual practices in. And again, adaptability is this great strength of the American pragmatists. So it's going to be very interesting how this thing goes. And part of where I would differ on this again is what's happening is that this certain segment of the American evangelical scene, and he's right to look at, let's say, these magisterial Protestants like the Christian Reformed Church. The part that was most mainline tends to be getting dragged down with the sinking mainline battleships. And so you see that fundamentalist evangelical move happening. And again, just roughly speaking, evangelicals tend to be a little bit more accommodationists. Let's say common grace. Fundamentalists tend to be a little bit more antithetical. Not at home in this world. And when they rise to the top of, let's say, political hierarchies, they tend to be more destructive. It's interesting how this woke right conversation has gone, because on one hand, the woke left wanted to get on top of institutions to smash them, to have sort of in a Marxist way a new utopia emerge of no racism, no sexism, John Lennonism, yada, yada, yada. It's been very interesting where the post-liberal conservatives get on top, they smash too. It's not entirely clear what they're going to build in its place, though. And that's one of the things that I keep challenging the post-liberals on. It's like, okay, I see your demolition project, but I don't really see your construction project, for the reason that this libertarian spirit, nobody can tell me what to do. Well, that post-liberal conservative project is a little bit more comfortable with authoritarians as long as they're the ones in power, which is always the trick with authoritarians. I believe that we need a firm hand. Whose hand will that be? Mine and the people who agree with me, of course. Oh, tell me how that goes. How granular are you going to get on those agreements? So, one of the things that I noted with Elizabeth Oldfield on my conversation with Sam was that you get this reactivity happening. But as Jonathan Peugeot said quite well, you don't build anything with reactivity. And so part of what I think we're going to see is a continual tearing down of things. Another, I was going to mention, there's an article by Ryan Burge, Megachurch America. It's very interesting in this article about megachurch demographics. It's not surprising that most megachurches are found in growing counties. What's also interesting is that megachurches are found in 90% of American counties are vast majority white. Now, if you think about that for a minute, it makes a lot of sense. Because whereas you tend to get more ethnic diversity in the cities that have been centers of immigration, the older expansion of population in the country was Western European, Northern European white. Megachurches are growing in much more diverse counties. And again, that makes sense because those are the counties that you're going to see growth. But in that way, the relationship, let's say, between the fundamentalists and the megachurches is super interesting because in some way you might see that megachurches are ways of bringing fundamentalism to the cities, but that fundamentalism is going to be adaptive. And so, so now back to the nomenclature puzzle. Are those churches, let's say, more evangelical? But they're still antithetical. So, and the other Substack I want to point to is Lauren Richmond has all of 71 subscribers, of which I am one. And he is a mainline guy. And, I think he's been really posting. He's not redeemed Zoomer, sort of a conservative, waiting for the mainline watermark to get so low that redeemed Zoomer can look around and say, this is mine. Because I don't know how much redeemed Zoomer understands how much those beautiful old buildings actually cost to maintain. In fact, even a not very beautiful, not tremendously old building like this one is probably what will sink living stones, because it's usually why churches close, because they can't afford two things. They can't afford the minister being a full-time, which is me, and they can't afford the maintenance on the building. Now, usually the first thing that happens when a church goes down is they drop the full-time minister because they can get a bivocational person. They can get a cheaper minister, or they can just get preaching in an elder or something. But those churches won't give up the building. They won't give up the building. Because that's edifice complex is just so deep in them. Which is a little bit of Catholic, even though Catholics, if you've got a bishop systems, bishop closes buildings because they look at their spreadsheet and it's like, can't afford that building anymore. All you people who go to this building, you go to the other building. You think people like that? No, they don't. They don't like it at all. And in fact, you'll probably lose a lot of those buildings people that you told to move buildings. Which is, again, part of the collapse or part of the loss that you see. The only thing that's buoyed the Catholics so that they're not looking as bad as the main line is, of course, immigration. All right, that's it for this. Really interested to hear your thoughts on this.